welcome to this month's Chopping Wealth. I'm Brian Portnoy, CEO of Shaping Wealth. And Chopping Wealth is a feature of our outsourced chief behavioral officer, OCBO platform. And every month we chop it up with an expert on money and advice or other things that we know our community will find interesting. I want to welcome Abby Davisson, a new friend over the last half year or so, 8 months, something like that. Over the last year, introduced by a mutual friend, Annie Duke, who's a friend of mine and Shaping Wealths. And before we dive in, and I ask Abby to, tell everybody about her, I want to point out that in every Chopping Wealth, including today, the chat box is live, the Q&A is live. So if you have questions, comments, please throw them in, and let's make this as vibrant a conversation as possible. So again, Abby, welcome. Tell us about yourself.
Well, yeah, I'm so delighted to be here, and I'm such a fan of what you're building at Shaping Wealth, Brian. So it's a pleasure. Yeah, so I am a bit of a mid-career changer. I was a Fortune 200 leader for the last decade. My career has been at the intersection of kind of social impact at the different sectors, right? So I started my career as a nonprofit consultant with Bain's spin-out arm that worked only with nonprofits. I worked with the New York City Department of Education, scaling school models that worked for the nation's largest school district. And then for the last decade, was at Gap, building and growing some proven workforce programs, and then running their corporate foundation, their social impact arm. But I had this opportunity in graduate school to take a class that changed my life. And the class became the inspiration for the book that we're going to talk about here, Money and Love. And so just in the last year and a half, I left that job and have been sharing the message of the book with the world, and have just stood up the Money and Love Institute, and am now enjoying the highs and lows of entrepreneurship. And it's been a wild ride, as I'm sure it has been for you.
I don't know what you're talking about. It's just at Shaping Wealth, it's so smooth and easy.
Totally. All the shapes are circles and, just curves.
Well, great. Happy to have you. And, the reason I was so eager to have you on Chopping Wealth was, we had some great conversations. You came very highly recommended. The book that you wrote is outstanding. So I want to get into that in some detail. And, we're here, I think, collectively in service to financial advisors to help them have better conversations about the things that really matter. And, there's a lot of fancy stuff to talk about, behavioral finance and neuroscience and positive psychology. But, at the end of the day, it's really about connecting with others. And like, that's your thing. So you've really built this amazing framework that I want to get into. I want to get to the framework by way of history, because I was reading another interview that you did, and you were just talking about the evolution of society, and in particular, the financial lives of women, the ability to have their own credit card, their own checking account. And it was in my lifetime, I'm on the older side, but it was in my lifetime that a woman was not allowed to have a credit card in her own name. I think it was 1974 that became possible, which is, frankly, I think it's ridiculous and it's mind-blowing, but it's really, it's unbelievable. So we're going to get to this like super cool modern day conversation about partners, couples, men and women in love, making so many financial decisions over the course of a lifetime. But I actually didn't want to lose sight of the fact that the way we are now isn't the way that we were a generation ago, let alone 2, 3 generations. It's an open-ended question, but like, can you give us your sense of like the important elements of the history that got us to where couples are having the types of conversations they are now versus the way it was for our parents or our grandparents?
Yeah, and it is mind blowing. I mean, it was just before my lifetime that happened, but it was very much the model that I grew up with, that there was a breadwinner breadwinner in a heterosexual marriage, which was the only marriage at the time, right? Was male, and that there was a caregiver, and that caregiver was female. And so, I grew up in a family where my mom was trained as a teacher and then a school librarian, and paused that career so she could, raise me, raise my brother. Meanwhile, my dad went to work every day, commuted into Manhattan. We lived in suburban New Jersey. He traveled 30% of his time for work. So he wasn't around as much because that was, not a thing, right? For most dads. And it's funny because I gave him, an advanced copy of my book, and he said, if your mom and I had had this, we might not have gotten married. And I was like, ooh, that's like a weird, like, Back to the Future moment where I might have erased myself. Like if they had had the conversations that we encourage, couples to have about career ambitions and about, how they want to share their finances, like that wasn't really what you talked about when you were getting married. Because as you said, like there wasn't a sharing of finances. There was like the woman was essentially dependent on the man for all the finances because she couldn't have her own bank account. She couldn't have her own credit card. People tell me stories of their mothers actually going on job interviews with their dads, like for lawyers, right? They would like go to the firm to interview to say, oh yes, I'm here to support, his career. So you don't have to worry about this. He'll be like a great worker. So it's really, as you said, kind of mind blowing that we're now, lots of things have changed, but we haven't updated. And those mental models are so powerful, right? What we saw our parents doing, what we saw, the people around us doing. So, just some of the trends that have changed is, this idea of dual career couples. So it used to be that in a couple, there was, like I said, one breadwinner, one caregiver. Now it's about 2/3 couples with kids where there are two people in the formal workplace. And if you look at millennials and sort of younger generations, it's 3/4 and, higher than that, even for folks, younger than millennials. So we're now living in a country where you really need two incomes to get by in so many cities, certainly San Francisco, where I live. I imagine it's similar in Chicago. Yeah. And so this idea of both people's careers needing to be prioritized, but, we haven't updated our financial education. You don't get like how to have these conversations in school. So we've sort of catapulted the workplace and the education part of it. Now women are outnumbering men and, colleges and graduate programs, but we haven't updated the way we're encouraging people to talk about these things. And that's where all the challenges come in. And that's why I'm so excited about being able to take the messages, again, of this class that I mentioned to a broader audience.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. I mean, I love bringing a historical lens to these things because we can often just take for granted what's in the moment. But the dynamic of a two paycheck family, the other things that you mentioned, they're relatively recent. And, I know a number of the folks here in the chat. I know that advisors are serving couples that are well into retirement and couples that are in their early 40s or even their, mid to late 30s. And so the cultural, I won't call it baggage, maybe I'll call it luggage, the cultural luggage that you bring along across these generations really varies. So, if what you're doing in your work and what we're doing at Shaping Wealth is all about kind of better conversation technologies, I just love kind of what you've built because it's so flexible and deployable. So I want to kind of get right into the model that seems to drive a lot of your thinking, the so-called 5 Cs. I'm gonna, I kind of want you to maybe give the quick backstory on how you got to 5 Cs. For what it's worth, the Geometry of Wealth has 4 Cs. So I kind of feel a little slighted.
We evolved. We built on the fun. Well, I love your C's too.
Well, I appreciate that. The guy next month has 6 Cs.
He's one-upping even me. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. By the end of the year, we're gonna have like 14 Cs. No, seriously. uh, give us tell us about the 5C model in terms of, I mean, maybe highlight it what it is, so we know people can write down what the C's are. Give us the backstory how you got there, and then let's kind of click for detail on each of them, and then we're going to deploy them across different scenarios. And with people on the call here today, by all means, chime in the chat or the Q&A with questions. So 5Cs, what are they?
Yeah, well, I'll start just as you said by zooming out and saying, like, why did we even come up with this framework? So the class that my co-author taught at Stanford Business School for many years did not have the 5Cs as part of it. That framework was not a part of the class. It was about all the different decisions you make at the intersection of money and love. But as we were writing the book, we realized, no two decisions are alike. Everyone is unique. But there are some commonalities that I know you're well familiar with in terms of our human biases that get in the way of good decisions. One is that people make decisions very quickly. They're using, a emotional response to decisions often. So we wanted a way to help people slow down, take their time, turn over the right rocks as they're thinking through a big decision to allow them to access a more rational type of thinking. And then the other piece is that, we encounter so many different decisions in life. So we wanted something that was flexible, meaning it could be applied to a variety of different decisions, but sturdy, meaning you could rely on the same decision framework over and over again. So that's where this idea of bringing the framework came in. And so, yes, I see that it's in the chat. So it is 5Cs. I'll touch on them now. You can put it back in the chat. So clarify what is most important to you, communicate with the person or people who are most involved in the decision, choices, so broaden your perspectives to include a variety of options, check in, which is asking for advice, guidance, and resources, and the fifth C is consequences. So considering the effects of your decisions across both the short term, long term, and how it will play out over time.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and looks like Neil put them in the chat, so everybody has them right in front, and we can kind of go through. So if I would play it back to you, because I want to use this in my personal life and I want to think about it professionally, but this is a 5-step decision-making framework, actually applicable to almost any imaginable situation, but you're specifically built this for tending to relationships, keeping them healthy, repairing ruptures where they might exist, elevating relationships to the next level. So kind of that love and money intersection being managed through this 5-part decision-making framework. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yes, and we talked about my earlier career, and it was really about making decisions when multiple bottom lines are involved, right? So if you think about, how I spent my time helping a large public company, think about, having a positive impact in the world, which also had to lead to a positive, impact on the bottom line. That's what we're trying to do in our personal lives too, right? We want to have strong relationships. We want to have thriving, bank accounts. We know there are trade-offs, and so the framework really helps you get crystal clear about what those trade-offs are, and make sure that you're making them in a deliberate way that helps you further your goals.
I liked every step, and I'm gonna try not to editorialize because I don't want to steal your thunder, but I loved clarify, because I've become, in part from what I've learned from Joy Leary and from Neil in our conversations with clients, big fan of self-awareness. Self-awareness is an engine for driving growth internally and then better relationships externally. Clarify for you is coming to terms with what it is you want. So tell us why this is the starting point for this framework.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's so much easier said than done, right? We have so many forces that are clouding us when we think about what do we really want. We sometimes think about, well, what did our parents want for us? We sometimes think about, well, what are my friends wanting, right? There's this force of mimetic desire, which is something that French philosopher Rene Girard came up with, which is like, we want what other people want. And it's really hard to tune out the noise and say, wait a minute, do I really want a vacation home, or I just feel like I should want it because that's what my contemporaries are doing, and like the kids at school are talking about going to their vacation homes, and so I feel like maybe I should be doing that for my kids. So the clarify step is really important because it's the North Star, and if you're clear about the first C, if you really do clarify, it actually makes all the other C's flow more easily. And I should say, Brian, like they're laid out in a linear fashion, but when you use this framework, it is very iterative. And so you can, clarify what you want, go through the other steps, and at some point you might actually re-clarify. And you might say, oh, whoa, 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 I thought this was important to me, but now that I've, talked to other people and I've looked at my choices, I'm actually going to re-clarify. And this happened to us. This happened to, my husband and I, when we, at one point in the height of the pandemic, thought we wanted a bigger house, because who didn't, at that point, like it was never enough space. No matter how much space you had. And that's what we sort of started out looking, and went very far down the path, like looking to buy a house in the suburbs, and re-clarified when we got to the point where we had to like pencil in the numbers and look at the mortgage rates of like, oh, that's actually going to really tie us to these jobs that we are, maybe don't want for the rest of our lives. And so we re-clarified that what was more important to us than more space was financial flexibility. And so, it's actually really helpful to start with whatever you think is your most important thing that you're trying to solve for, even if you're not 100% sure, because chances are, as you go through the framework, it will help you get more clear about that. And you can start with your core values. That's something that's also really helpful in terms of self-awareness. We both think about that. But yeah, the clarify step is the first, because it's the most important and the hardest for so many of us.
Yeah, but it also leaves breadcrumbs throughout the whole process, right? Because like you're kind of figuring out who you are, and so this idea of mimetic desire, I guess I've given this a little bit of thought, and I often wonder whether there's any true authentic desire versus things that are presented to us. I mean, we could get pretty existential about it, but from the so maybe we'll put a floor on getting too deep on mimetic desire and all that. But is it not simply, but is it a matter of coming to terms with your values, weighing pros and cons, being able to articulate the trade-offs, but then appreciating that you might change your mind later? I mean, I guess, is there, in your framework, clarify as a step? So, hey, what do you want? That's the question. And hey, maybe I want to get married and sort of land here, or maybe I want a career that's going to take me to another part of the world, and I can't have both. Those are the trade-offs. Is your advice at this stage, hey, just be honest with yourself and come to terms with what the choices are, or are there other layers to it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you need to start somewhere, right? So it's a stake that you put in the ground to say, this, if I had to say right now what's most important to me, it would be a career where I get to travel the world, right? Let's just say that. So then, you move to the second C, and that's to communicate. And, say you're starting to date someone, and, you think that there is a potential that you might want to spend more time with this person. So, that's when we say, like, bring these things up early on. Communicate before you feel ready. And we talk about communication as not just the step of sharing what's most important to you, but also listening and hearing what they have to say, such that you can be influenced by it, right? Like, so many of us share, like, say what we want, and then like we're already thinking about, like, here are the 5 reasons, right? And we're like anticipating what their response might be and what their response would be. Like, it's really about getting quiet and listening and being able to be influenced. And so, talk about having conversations in a changed world, right? Like, I met my current husband in business school, and I did want an ambitious career. I also wanted children. I hadn't seen models in my own life for how I could have both. And so because we happened to be taking the class that my co-author was teaching at the time, we got to talk about, hey, what are your ambitions? What are mine? Like, this means we're going to be doing something that our parents didn't do, right? Like, both of our moms put their career on pause to raise kids. I wasn't willing to do that. He didn't want to, marry somebody who was going to do that. And so, we talked about it. That's not to say that then, if he said, well, I really envisioned having someone, who would be the primary caregiver, like that might make me change my mind if I said, well, I want to be with you more than I want, right? Like it's not to say that like what you clarify at the beginning always has to stay true. The key part is having the conversation and having conversations that are really difficult, because these are, conversations at the intersection of money and love in particular are really nerve-wracking to have, right? And I know the advisors are facilitating these conversations with their clients, and it's super vulnerable. Like, not only are you talking about money, but you're talking about things that you care deeply about too, and that is like double vulnerability.
Right. Yeah. So our partner Joy says, because she's a practicing therapist, in addition to the work she does at Shaping Wealth, that people come to her office to talk about two things, money and sex, but those are never the things they're really there to talk about. Money is this emotional lightning rod that just captures everything that is deep inside of us: fear, hope, greed, joy, and envy, anger, you name it. Because like us, you're training and working with financial advisors at your Money and Love Institute. Is it Money and Love or Money Love?
Money and love.
What's your, I mean, I'm trying to, I really want to go methodically through this 5-part framework because I think it's so good. The work that you do with advisors to intervene in this communication step, you alluded to, this could be a big pitfall, because we know that when you get into that meeting with a husband and wife, or just with partners, and they are revealing themselves in a way, their emotional baggage, as through the lens of money. It might be the first time we hear this sometimes from advisors. Like, clients are having a conversation they've been married for 30 years and they're having this conversation for the first time in front of you. The advice that you give to the advisors on how to create the space where that communication happens most effectively, what do you say?
We know so much. Well, first of all, I love what someone's put in the chat. Steven says, in my humble opinion, money reveals what we love or don't love. I mean, yeah, our budgets are our priorities, right? It's just like a company's budget highlights what they prioritize. Like, our personal budgets highlights what we prioritize. And if we said, oh, I don't have the money for that, it's like, well, we're not prioritizing, right? Just like time, right? I don't have time to do that. It just means it's not a priority now. So I think getting really clear about that is super important. But in terms of the steps for the advice for effective communication, if someone is bringing a conversation into the advising table that they've never had before, I think it's important to say, like, oh, it sounds like this isn't something you've spent a lot of time talking about. Why don't you go away in between now and the next time we meet? Why don't you find some time to talk about this? And so there are a couple of guideposts that we have found to be effective and that the research supports. One is get out of your day-to-day zone, right? So if you typically have these conversations on the fly, you're like brushing your teeth right before you go to bed, or you're trying to get the kids out the door to school, like that is not the time for the conversation. Get out of your house, get out of the stressors that remind you of the chaos of everyday life. Go on a walk, find a body of water. Like, there's something that's effective about having these conversations where you're not facing each other, right? So you're not like having the vulnerable, like, I'm looking directly into your eyes. Could be on a long car ride, right? There are ways to have this effectively that can reduce some of that vulnerability. And then, have the conversation in a way, like make an appointment, just like you would with someone, externally, at a good time for both of you, have the conversation, and then come back and, once you've discussed it, bring the advisor along into what you've talked about. But it's really hard when you sort of wade into that for the first time with people who have not, effectively communicated with each other.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know money dates have become kind of a institution, something, you sort of set time aside, go out, have a meal, but you know what you're going to be talking about. Those can be great, those can be awkward. It's interesting. All right. So step one was clarify what you want. Step two was as you are in the relationship, you're communicating, which isn't just expressing, it's also understanding, listening, developing empathy for the other's view. The third step is choices.
Yeah, and really, when we're in these decision points, we see the extremes. It becomes very binary, right? So we see the like, you know, um, sell the house and move to a cabin in the woods, or build a bigger house, right? Like we see these sort of extremes, and the choices step is really about broadening your range of choices, because that really leads to better decision making. So it's about generating more choices than you initially see when you first see what the two options are. Do I marry this person or do I break up with them? Well, there's probably somewhere in between where you could, try the relationship on for size. And the choices. So I would say the clarify and the communicate step go well together, because clarifying and communicating is a bit of a dance. You clarify what you want, you communicate it with someone that's important to you, sometimes with the help of a third party expert, right? And you sort of change based on what you've clarified, based on what you hear from the person you're communicating with. Choices and check-in go well together in the same way. So you're broadening your range of choices by checking in with people who are have gone through this experience before, with published studies, research around what has been shown to be true scientifically, right? So there's a way of generating more choices through the data gathering. Like, it's what Annie Duke calls the outside view. You're trying to get, outside of your own perspective. You've gotten the inside view from the clarify step and the communicate step. Now you're getting outside. You're talking to people who have a bit of distance, who are not directly involved with this decision. They could be a little bit more dispassionate about it. And you're also seeing, like, has there been research done on this? That's something that my husband and I looked at when we were making our decision about moving. I was writing the chapter on moving at the same time. I mean, talk about me search. It was like perfect. And we came across this study that had been published in the Journal of Environmental Psychology about the effect of square footage on family harmony. And, you would think that as houses get bigger, if you have more square footage per person, family harmony increases, right? Well, to a point, and then it's diminishing returns. And particularly for families with boys can feel disconnected and lonely at a certain square footage density. So that was interesting. We have two boys. And people often, think that they need to build and build and build. And suddenly you end up where everyone has their own wing and you're not seeing each other. And, we were like, oh, that's interesting. And the other thing the study said that we thought was interesting was this idea of your perception of space actually matters more than the actual square footage itself. If you view your space as fit for purpose, if you have, no matter how small it is, you have, designated zones for all the activities you want to do, you have like maybe more than one bathroom for, the 5 people, but that actually matters more than the density, the square footage per person itself. And so we realized that through the help of checking in with that published study, that maybe actually we had to change our perception of the square of space of our house. We then generated additional choices. I was working from home in my boy's bedroom, so it was bugging me to have like Lego bricks underfoot and a bunk bed behind me. But instead of moving, I thought of, what if I rented an office nearby? At this point, I had left my corporate job and I was, starting to launch the book and start the Institute. And I actually, one of the additional choices I generated was, oh, I could rent a space within walking distance. It would get me out of the boys' bedroom without the financial and logistical burden of moving. And so that was, a way that I solved the space problem in a way that didn't initially occur to me when I just saw either we stay here and I'll be miserable, or we move and, that's the way to get more space.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the choices step, the third step is really it's another C, but it's creativity. It's thinking about what's possible. And, I guess it's just my habit. I think about where advisors fit into this. It's actually a perfect opportunity for an advisor to see the way a couple is talking about the choices they believe they have. And, we do veer often toward either or situations. It's like, well, we got to stay where we are or we have to move. Well, maybe not. Maybe there are other things. Um, so it seems like the advisor can play a very interesting role at this stage, which is probably not something, technically you'd learn in the CFP curriculum. It's just, working alongside somebody to be a thinking partner and to challenge and suggest. So we're going to go to the fourth C, which you've touched on for a bit, but there's a lot more to the check-in stage. It was probably the fourth stage. Check-in was the most surprising part of the framework for me, because not that it was super counterintuitive, but I'm like, oh yeah, this makes a lot of sense. I just didn't see this coming. And as we get into that, if there are any advisors who on the call who have heard about the choices stage and the role of creativity, if you have any good examples, please throw them in the mix and we can maybe opine on them, where you kind of helped a client or a family think outside the box. So the check-in, this is where you're kind of connecting to your broader network. In a sense, it's validating good ideas. It's coming up with new ideas, new choices as well, right? So what is check-in?
Well, first of all, thanks for giving me a sixth C with creativity, because now I can, come back on shaping wealth, right? When I keep adding more.
Yeah, no, we have an arms race at C's. I think I'm stuck with my four C's, so I'm just, I'm old school, but yeah.
Yeah. So check in, and it's interesting. I think a lot of people do think of the third party experts, like an advisor in the check in step. But it really is anyone who could be helpful to you. And often we get asked two questions. One is, what's the role of intuition in the framework? Because there are very analytical people who want to kind of go through something like this, and then there are people who are like, well, I just go with my gut, right? And partly having the framework helps you get away from thinking you need to go with your gut all the time. I mean, we have a fun quiz on our book website, moneylovebook.com, which helps to get at your decision making style. And there are definitely people who are gut trusters, but the check in step is actually a way to check in with your intuition. So there are the outside experts you can check in with, but you can also kind of check in with yourself, see how things are landing. If you missed it at the clarify step, it's another place where you can check in with yourself. But it's also, the other thing we get asked is like, well, how many people should I check in with? Because there are people who just want all the data, right? They want all the information. They're like, okay, well, I'm going to start checking in with like 50 people. And the answer is, it really depends on the type of question it is. Because if it's something around, looking for a new job or switching careers, like there is research about the importance of weak ties, right? So that's the kind of decision that it is helpful to share with the world. Decisions about very personal things like whether to have another child, or one of the people we talked to recently is making end of life decisions for themselves, right? That's not necessarily something where you're going to have 50 conversations about it. You might kind of ask your closest, trusted people who have made decisions before in a way that you admire about how they approach that decision, because you're not asking them in the check-in step, what should I do? You're asking them, how should I be thinking about this decision, or how have you thought through a similar decision in the past? And advisors can be super helpful at this stage because they have pattern recognition, right? They've seen people make these decisions in a broader way than just you as an individual have. So they can say, I've seen people do X, or I've seen people do Y, and generate some of those creative choices. But they can also give people a sense of reassurance of, yes, I've seen people do this and it's worked out, and I should say, Brian, that this framework is not at all, we're not suggesting that it's like the bulletproof way to make the perfect decision. It's a way to feel confident about the covering all the bases, and that you've, like I said, turned over the right rocks, and it does result in more confidence as a result, but not because it always results in the perfect decision, because there's still monkey wrenches that get thrown at us. And there's still, things you couldn't have anticipated. But, knowing from my personal experience, having made decisions without this framework, and now, for the past several years, having made it with this framework, it's night and day in terms of my level of confidence about those decisions, even though I don't know the result.
Right, right, right. Well, yeah, I mean, you could play the counterfactual game, but which can be fun, but often pointless because who knows? And I'm always, half the people on this call are sick of me quoting George Box, who said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So, if you find the 5 C's useful, then it's a good model. And if there's another decision-making model that, you want to bring along with you, that's cool too. Let's wrap up with consequence, the fifth one, and then I'd love to kind of maybe walk through some real world examples for couples, and maybe figure out how advisors get involved in that process. But like, let's wrap up with number 5.
Yeah. So because of our short-term bias, we often see the short-term consequences, right? We over-index on, what is this going to do in the short term? And so the consequences step is really helping you trick your brain by playing it forward into, the mid-range consequences and the long-term consequences, because, sometimes those close-in consequences are really hard. So like, I'll give you an example. We moved my now 5th grader to a different school last year. And like, we were ruining his life from his perspective, right? It was like he was leaving his friends, the school he had grown up in since pre-K. And we were trying to help him understand, like, yeah, that's going to be really hard. However, the new school goes up until 8th grade. So it's going to be actually less disruptive in the longer term for you to go to this school, even though it means leaving your friends in the short term. And so, that's hard for a 9-year-old or 10-year-old at that point to understand. It's also hard for a lot of, people our age to understand. So the consequence is just making sure you're kind of doing, your diligence by thinking about different time horizons, and by, playing out, what Annie calls the, expected value calculation, right? You're really trying to say, what's the worst thing that could happen? What's the best thing that could happen? And, then therefore there's probably something in between, which is what will actually happen.
That's great. That's great. So we have the framework, and like, we can just roll through. Anyone with the framework can roll through so many different life's decisions, especially related to relationships, love, and money. I mean, the book kind of sets out the framework, and then you've got what, six or seven different chapters that are kind of substantive, like when to get married, when to move, who does homework, housework, taking care of aging relatives, aging parents, when to end a marriage. There's a lot of so many different ways we could go. As you've kind of lived this book and talked about it and coached, what's kind of maybe walk us through the 5 C's through the lens of kind of an example or a stage in life that you think really brings it to life. I'd be curious what makes this model really sing.
Yeah, well, and like I said, I've applied it so much to my own life.
Yeah, if you want to talk about that, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's one that I think a lot of advisors are hearing. I mean, I'm in the Bay Area, right, in San Francisco. So there's a lot of tech. There's a lot of people who are, kind of in the midst of upheaval that tech is experiencing right now. And often there are people who have either, through a layoff situation, or even a voluntary situation, they're thinking about making a pretty dramatic career change, right? They've been in a lucrative, what they thought was stable, what was stable for a lot of years career. And either by virtue of, again, voluntary or involuntary, they're thinking about making a change. And it's anxiety producing, because it involves, potentially accepting, a lower, lifestyle than they have been accustomed to, or, they've sort of increased their lifestyle according to their paychecks over the years, and this would really, involve dramatically paring back. So, and those were some of the things that my husband and I were considering when we were, thinking about our own career pivots. So I should say, my husband and I met in graduate school. To get into Stanford Business School, you have to write an essay about what are your short-term career plans and your long-term career plans? And so we had each, before we knew each other, written about our long-term career plans involved entrepreneurship of some sort. Like we both wanted to start something someday. And we joke that we looked at our watches at one point and he said, well, it looks like it's getting to be long term. We better like start those things that we said we were going to do back when we were trying to get into graduate school. So we both, had clarified that we wanted to start our own things. My husband had actually left his job as the CFO of a tech company during the pandemic. Our kids were, learning from Zoom school. We had a rotating cast of caregivers. It was not only Zoom school, it was Zoom kindergarten and second grade, which, like, if anything should not be a thing, it's Zoom kindergarten, but there we were. And so we had this rotating cast of caregivers who were helping, get our kids onto their Zoom tasks while we did our, executive roles in different rooms at our house. This is why we were looking for more space, by the way. And so, we clarified that we wanted to have entrepreneurship be a part of our next role. The standard model is for one person to go first, right? So one person does the risky thing, the other person, keeps the stable job with the health insurance. And what we were talking about was doing something that was not conventional. So we communicated with each other about this. We talked about, he was getting headhunted for like other CFO roles that he wasn't very excited about. So I was encouraging him to like put the wheels in motion and start his entrepreneurial thing. I was also thinking like, oh, wow, I guess that means that like I'm going to be the one to stick in the steady corporate role and, keep the health insurance and all of that. So we had these conversations on hikes. Like that's where we tend to have our best communication. So I was trying different things internally, right? I was pitching myself to a new role, a new boss. That didn't quite work. I was, because I was writing the book on nights and weekends and occasional days off. I was pretty burnt out at that point. I pitched my, a potential sabbatical. That didn't work out. I interviewed for a new role, that I got through a recruiter on LinkedIn. And this is where the check-in, these were all the choices I was generating, right? Like this is what I could do. And I got, very far in that interview process, one of the final two candidates, and it was for like my job, but in a bigger, more profitable company. And I didn't get it. And so what was so interesting, Brian, is that instead of being disappointed, I was so relieved.
Okay.
That was like the check-in step for me, where I was like, okay, let me acknowledge this emotion of relief. Think that maybe it's not just, another big corporate job that I want while my husband does something entrepreneurial, but maybe it's actually that I leave too. So then we got very quickly to talking to a financial advisor. So we don't have one. It's like, my husband and I, because we're two MBAs, we're like, oh, we could do this, right? So it's like, a little dangerous to have a little bit of knowledge. We don't have enough, but we had, some assets in a large financial institution. So they said, great, like you can talk to an advisor here. So this was a really interesting conversation. We were checking in about, we both want to make these entrepreneurial pivots. How should we be thinking about this next phase? And the advisor, who was very nice, kind of said, well, our model doesn't work that way. Like we can plug in some zeros for a number of years and see what that does for your retirement. But like, I can't really tell you how to think about this next phase. And that was not helpful to us because, it wasn't helping us think through, well, how would we make this decision? I mean, fortunately, there was this framework we could look to. But in that case, the third party wasn't helpful. So, we checked in with other folks who had made career pivots. We, tried to understand like how we should be budgeting. And because we have MBAs, we did our own model for how we should be thinking about this financially. We became very focused on the financial consequences, obviously. So we thought about, okay, well, what would minimize the downside? I stayed until I got my bonus deposited. We thought about, trade-offs we could make about like, where in our budget, what are the levers we could adjust to minimize the change in our lifestyle. Fortunately, we didn't move. We stayed in our house that provided us more financial flexibility. But I will say once I made the decision mentally to leave, it actually opened up the choices in my head in a different way. So there is this decision point where once I said, okay, I think it probably means leaving as well and having this, time where we're doing double entrepreneurship. And that let me think more creatively about, okay, well, what could I do with the book and what, would the business be there? And it was about this time where we were talking to folks, and there were people who would come up to us after we talked about our books. We were doing pre-publicity, and some of them were financial advisors, and they said this would be so helpful to our clients. And in my own experience, talking to an advisor that was not helpful, I realized yes, this actually could be so helpful for folks who are helping people think through complex money and love decisions. And even though that's not where my background is, I think there's a there, and that became the first client of the Money and Love Institute, is working with a mid-sized firm to coach their advisors, to train their advisors in the tools and techniques, license the tools, and use them with their own clients. And it's been really, really interesting to see how my own experience is not unique. There's a lot of people out there thinking of making big career changes, because one of the other trends driving this right now is longevity, right? There is this trend towards, people born today, some scientists estimate will live to be over 100. And what doesn't work is just stretching out that middle phase, right? We get educated, we work, and then we retire. And when you stretch out how long we live, you actually stretch out that middle working phase. And there's a fabulous book that we researched as part of our own research called The 100-Year Life. And it talks about, really needing to normalize these periods of reinvestment and reinvention, repotting, I call it, of our careers. And I think advisors are absolutely going to need to help people think through how to think about those different phases differently as we live longer.
I want to, believe it or not, we're rounding the bend. We have about 10 minutes left. I want to get into a little detail on the Money and Love Institute. We were sort of just going there, but Stephen, one of our favorites here at Shaping Wealth, proud alumni of our coaching programs. He asks, I think, an important foundational question about financial therapy. And in your framework, I think in the advice and guidance that you give, the interactions that you have, how do you walk the line between advisor, financial therapy, need for actual individual or marital counseling? And Stephen, who's in the trenches every day helping people, he sees this. I think a lot of people on the call see this. Couples and money, it's tough, raises a lot of issues. Things get very sensitive very quickly. What's your take on that line between advice versus therapy? And when should someone, or a couple, find kind of additional outside resources to help them navigate? Because in point of fact, advisors are not therapists, and there is a line, and they are not qualified to provide marriage counseling.
Absolutely. I mean, such a good question. I mean, first of all, I am a huge fan of experts in any dimension, right? So, absolutely, I see the need for individual therapists, for marriage therapists, couples therapists, not just as a preventative measure or as a sort of when things have gone too far, but also the way you work with a personal trainer at the gym, like as a coach, as someone to make sure that you are having best practices along the way. So I think that's a trend that will continue, as people not going to a marriage therapist as a last resort, but actually as a way to make sure your relationship is healthy. But I think what you're talking about is when it is clear that there is something that's come up in the advising room that is beyond the scope of the training that the advisor has. And I absolutely think if it's getting in the way of productive conversations, if you start to see over a number of sessions that there is this pattern that is either preventing the couple from making decisions, or it's clear that like one person is totally disengaged and not despite all your best efforts, not really participating in a way that shows they're an equal decision maker, that might be something to bring up. And I know it's a very touchy subject. I often say, you can think about others in your practice that have found this helpful and say, because I think we all want to feel like, I'm not the only one, right, who has this issue. So you can say, I've worked with this other couple, they realized there were some things, beyond the financial conversations that they really needed to address. I think it's always helpful when you have trusted referrals. That's something that is often a daunting part of the process, is to even find, someone who is trusted and is well regarded. So making sure that you have that referral list to say, I'm happy to pass on some names. You could have a conversation, see what would be helpful. Knowing that those things are separate, right? You're not going to like have the conversation with the therapist. Like that's something that you guys can address, but it might be, it might make things flow more easily in our conversations too, right? So there are red flags. There are certainly, behaviors that should be red flags for folks. And again, if it's like, completely shutting someone down, completely, I mean, the Gottmans have really great research on this about like the four horsemen they call of behaviors that are they say they can tell within 30 seconds of a couple's interacting whether they're going to get divorced, right? So this idea of like watching for those behaviors, and those are the times where it may be helpful to bring up the idea of separate therapy for a couple.
Yeah, yeah. I'd be curious if any advisors want to throw into the chat whether or not that they have a list of trusted references, whether it be in marriage counseling or other other areas. Because if you can communicate at the beginning of a relationship, so it could be months or years before some problem arises, but like, hey, we've got this outside network of helpers that might be of relevance to you someday. That's a very different feel than in the moment saying, I think you need marriage counseling and I got a guy or a gal.
And that's the role. I mean, just to add on that, Brian, like you and I have talked about the role of advisor becoming much more of a coach role, right? Of a, you're not just in there to look at your asset allocation and to talk about, here's where I think we should adjust things. It's, if I'm going to continue to pay these fees, which, there's not going to be a compression of fees, there's going to be an increase in expectations of what they're getting. And that idea of being a one-stop shop for all of the dimensions of life, of, helping you improve your relationship, helping you, think through your philanthropic giving, right? All the different dimensions that can constitute meaning and fulfillment. That's something that advisors, I think, would behoove them to start building out, so that you, as you mentioned, that could be a point of differentiation in the onboarding process, as opposed to oh, by the way, like, I think you need to do this before we meet again.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'm always just blown away by the spectrum or the variety that we see in the industry globally, all the way from registered life planners and all out life coaches to old school brokers who want to just sell you good or attractive securities and everything in between. I don't think there's any doubt, though, that most people seeking advice have kind of a set of things on their mind that go well beyond just the portfolio. So by way of wrapping up, tell us more about the Money and Love Institute. I want to make sure everybody in the call understands what you've put out into the world, the type of advisors that you work with, and the type of work that you do.
Yeah, thank you. And it's been so amazing to learn from what you've done and all the research you've done as you've built Shaping Wealth. So I'm a big fan of what you're doing. But the Institute is really to help the experts help their clients make more deliberate, high stakes decisions. And so if you think about, what advisors are doing is helping people increase their happiness, their prosperity, and their fulfillment, their funded contentment, which I know is your phrase, right? And so we're here to take the evidence-based actionable tools and research that are part of the book for sure, but we've built out specifically for advisors, and be a train the trainer, right? Provide training, provide licensed tools. We've done, because I know a lot of firms, small to mid-sized firms are doing are having kind of thought leaders come on and be experts. So we've designed and facilitated one-day universities for firms clients where they can, learn more. And advisors are the facilitators of small group discussions around money and love. That's been really popular with folks. And follow-on coaching. So office hours, ways that advisors can get advice on how to build more effective relationships with their clients and how to help clients make more effective decisions that they feel confident about. Because in this world of increasing uncertainty, right, we have so much change coming at us, whether it's, the aftermath of COVID, climate uncertainty, job uncertainty fueled by AI and other technologies, right? There's so many changes that are happening so rapidly that having a flexible but sturdy framework is so much more important for everyone to feel comfortable making decisions in the pace of increasing change.
Yeah, yeah, it's amazing. And what's the website so that people can check it out?
It's moneyloveinstitute.com.
Believe it or not, that hour went pretty quickly, huh?
It did. It did. It was fun.
Yeah. There's about, 19 different case studies that we could walk through, and well, we'll keep the dialogue going, and hopefully find some joint programming to do. I just want to say I really appreciate what you're putting into the world, and I hope those on the call today were I'm sure able to download some really interesting ideas, including and especially the 5 C's framework. It just, all models are wrong, but some are useful. This one is, to me, patently, useful. I mean, it's pretty clear how you can deploy this in your relationship. So, Abby Davisson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been delightful.
Yes, and for everybody, this was Chopping Wealth, a feature of your outsourced chief behavioral officer. We'll catch you next month.